Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time talking about war, in particular what's called a just war theory. But it really brings us into, the really important questions of what is the role of government when it comes to declaring war and even fighting a war to protect its citizens. And we would hope that no one would have to be engaged in any more military conflict. But I think we've seen over the last few decades that has not been the case. So what about the use of military force? How do we think about it from a biblical point of view, and how do we think about it from a constitutional point of view? It, first of all, was something that the framers of the Constitution had to think about. After the Revolutionary War, they wanted to begin to think, how much power would we give to the president, and what role would we give to Congress in a very important decision about going to war? And so, first of all, of course, they created in the Constitution various checks and balances concerning war powers. They understood that the president needed to have enough authority to wage war, but they also wanted Congress to play an important role. On one hand, they recognized that George Washington, who ended up being our first president, and I think even in the back of the minds of individuals at that Constitutional Convention, they were thinking George Washington. They had seen an individual who was a general, but at the same time, they didn't want to have one individual, whether it was the general in the Revolutionary War or whether it's the commander-in-chief in after the war was fought, and now you are establishing this republic known as the United States. They didn't want to have its sole authority. So in Article 1, Section 8, it does give Congress the power to declare war, and that declaring of war has been used fairly sparingly. There have only really been 5 major declarations of war. That would be the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, then, of course, World War I and World War II. Everything since then, and I'm going to come back to this in just a little bit as we talk about people that have been critical about some of this, all of those, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, Desert Storm, all of those basically have just been approved military actions. But Article 2 of the Constitution declares that the president shall serve as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That was easy to do when, in some cases, you had individuals in the presidency who were generals, whether it's George Washington, Andrew Jackson, all the way to Dwight Eisenhower. But it also understood that even if you had civilians, those who had not served in the military, nevertheless, they were still in charge of the armed forces and put the armed forces in the executive branch. And then, of course, you had, as we'll talk about a little bit later, the War Powers Resolution that was passed a number of years ago to really begin to pull in some checks on the president, and we'll talk about its significance even in some of the current debate. But how do we think about this biblically? That's what I want to focus on now for a while. And first of all, if you go to the New Testament, you see in Romans 13 that the Apostle Paul is talking about government being a servant. And then in verse 4 of Romans 13, he says, "If you do good, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." The sword, of course, is the idea of the government using it to defeat evildoers. It could be fighting crime within the country, or repelling or attacking foreign invaders to a country. So it would involve both the criminal justice system, I think, and the military system. In the Old Testament, you have in Ecclesiastes 3:8 that there was a time for war and a time for peace. And if nothing else, maybe the implication is that determining when to actually fight a war or declare a war is a difficult situation. And so now we're going to move really from the few comments about war in the Old or New Testament to what has been kind of a Christian tradition. And that is Christian theologians and scholars have developed what is called a just war criteria. And these raise questions about whether a military action is a just cause, whether it's a just intention, whether it's the last resort, a formal declaration, whether it has limited objectives. And then even during warfare, there are two other criteria which are relevant, and that is the use of proportionate means and non-combatant immunity. But, when you think about this idea of war breaks down into one of three categories. Either activism, that is, it's always right to participate in war; pacifism, that it's never right to participate in war; or selectivism, it is right to participate in some wars. And this is where most Christians fit in. I recognize, even as we broadcast this, we have individuals that are part of the historic peace churches that have believed in pacifism, so I understand that. But most Christians recognize that a just war fits into this category of selectivism. And, if you think about it, the pacifism that you see in the past really was based upon two assumptions. First, it was the assumption that any of the wars in the Old Testament have no bearing in the New Testament, but that's difficult to argue. Or that, second of all, the teachings of Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount apply to not only individuals, but government. And you can think about that. And we run into situations where people have said, well, I believe that it is not right for us to actually go against an enemy, and we should never pick up the sword. Matter of fact, he who picks up the sword will perish by the sword, Jesus says in Mark 6. Or that he told us to actually turn the other cheek. But I think the whole context of the Sermon on the Mount fits in there. And a little bit later, I'm going to talk about this whole idea of just war and some of the objections. And so that's one of the objections. The other objection we're going to look at a little bit later is the whole question as to whether or not the just war, which was developed when you were talking about nation states, how does that now apply when we're talking about a terrorist activity? So we're going to take a break, but when we come back, we recognize that the just war theory starts, first of all, with Augustine, who lived in the 4th and 5th century, developed it really as kind of an extension of Romans 13, this idea that government does not bear the sword for nothing, and actually rulers hold no terror for those who do right. And if you want to be free of authority, then certainly obey government. And he argued that not all wars were morally justified. He said it makes a great difference by which causes and under which authorities men undertake wars that must be waged, and so developed kind of this first idea of this theory for a framework for military action that was further developed by Aquinas. So Augustine and Aquinas are kind of, the, if you will, the patron saints of this idea of a just war. But when we come back, I want to look at those 7 particular issues, 5 that relate to what decisions need to be made before you go to war, 2 more that are talking about our conduct during war, and then I want to try to relate to some of the objections to that. And then once we get into the objections, I want to pull from a couple of other individuals that have written about this, some who have felt that even some of the actions that have been taken by the last 2 or 3 presidents might not even fit under a just war criteria. So we'll get into some of that in more detail. But this is a very important issue. It is one of the material issues in my book, A Christian Ethics in Plain Language. In my chapter on government and civil disobedience, I have a whole section on just war. So we'll summarize some of that material. But again, this book's available at Point of View if you'd like to get a copy. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The The longest impact a president can make on the country is through the federal judges he appoints to the court. After 3 years in office, President Trump has appointed and has confirmed more federal judges than previous presidents in the last few decades. The highest court below the Supreme Court is the Circuit Court. More than a quarter of the U.S. Circuit Court judges are Trump nominees. Let's put this in perspective. President Obama appointed and confirmed 55 Circuit Court judges by the end of his 8 years in office. Already, President Trump has appointed and confirmed 50 judges to the Circuit Court benches. The Trump appointments have already flipped 3 circuit courts to majority Republican-appointed judges. These courts will be hearing significant cases involving a wide range of issues. Remember that very few court cases, probably about 70 or 80, ever reach the Supreme Court. The decisions rendered by these circuit courts establish precedents and have a significant influence in laws and policies. Overall, President Trump has installed a total of 187 federal judges, most of whom are young and will likely serve a very long time. Moreover, most of these judges hold to a belief in originalism, meaning they interpret the Constitution according to its original intent. The editors of the Wall Street Journal explain why this is good. They said a new era of originalism in the court should be good for the law and for the public reputation of the judiciary as a nonpartisan interpreter of the Constitution. Such an era may even be good for progressives who will have to win their arguments the old-fashioned way, via political debate and elections. I agree that this new era will be good for America because it will be based on the proper interpretation of the Constitution. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking about this idea of a just war criteria. We're going to look at 7, 5 that have to do with what happens before you go to war, and then 2 more afterwards. On the way to war, just ad bellum, and then, of course, in the midst of war, just al bello. And so these are the 7 that are oftentimes understood as the criteria. The first one is this idea of a just cause. That is, that all aggression is condemned in just war theory. Participation is prompted by a just cause or defensive cause. No war of unprovoked aggression can ever be justified. Now, this, of course, led to an interesting debate back in the early part of the 21st century after we had been attacked on 9/11. Then the question was, can we do something that might be considered a preventive war? And so this is where some of the debate has taken place since then. But the idea is that certainly there would be a just cause. In other words, this idea that any aggression is permissible, that gets back to that idea of activism, where any particular idea could be justified, any kind of war could be justified, and that's not what nations that are trying to follow this idea of a just war would actually do. The second is the idea of just intention. Just as you should have a just cause, you should have a just intention. War must be done so that you can secure a just peace for all the parties involved. And this idea of war for revenge or conquest is not really a legitimate motive. The third one would be the idea of a last resort. War must be engaged as a last resort, and as a result, we might think about how this can happen with diplomacy and economic pressure that has been exhausted. So again, this idea of just cause, just intention, just resort. Then a couple more. a formal declaration. That is, war must be initiated with a formal declaration by properly constituted authorities. This one has become somewhat contentious as well, because you just heard me say a few minutes ago that the last time we had a formal declaration of war was back in World War II. Now, the way in which various members of Congress and presidents have been able to get around that is that they have actually not passed in Congress an authorization to go to war, but an authorization to use military force. And this authorized use of military force, an AUMF, has been used a number of times or justified a number of times for military action. But it is an important issue because is there a formal declaration? And, of course, what that might mean, and then also by properly constituted authorities. The flip side of this, as we'll talk about in just a minute, you don't really have properly constituted authorities when you're talking about various kind of terrorist groups. That could be Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, or others. So that's an important issue to begin to discuss and debate as well. But the fifth and final one of the criteria before you go to war is limited objectives. War must be characterized by limited objectives such as peace. The idea of complete destruction is really an improper objective. You have some people say, let's just bomb them back to the Stone Age. Let's turn their capital into a parking lot. Well, those are understandable when people are looking for revenge or vengeance. But that's not part of what is called the just war theory. War must be waged in such a way that once peace is attainable, hostilities cease. And so those are the 5 criteria that were set forth to begin to think through whether a particular war is justifiable and whether or not it could even be declared. Then there are 2 more, and one of those is called proportionate means. That is, combatants may not be subjected to greater harm than is necessary to secure victory. This, of course, became a big issue with the whole question of, is it reasonable to drop an atomic bomb, which will probably end the war, but in the process subject a great number of people, basically non-combatants, to greater harm? And so that has certainly been an issue. And underneath that has been the whole question about the types of weapons, the amount of force that could be used in order to repel aggression and secure a just peace. Even before we dropped a bomb, the firebombing of Dresden and some of these examples sometimes are used as well. And the second one, which I've already alluded to, but let me come back to that, is the idea of non-combatant immunity. Military forces must respect individuals and groups not participating in the conflict. And one of the ways in which you can identify whether a particular government has been engaged in what oftentimes is called ethnic cleansing or war crimes is when they actually went and destroyed and killed non-combatants in the midst of war. Only government forces or agents are legitimate targets. Again, the difficulty of that is, first of all, in even some of the wars, you had individuals that would, as spies, pretend to be something else, or even wear the opposite uniform of individuals in order to sneak past them. So is that appropriate? And even more so as we come to this area of terrorism, terrorists don't wear uniforms that identify themselves as being part of a particular country. So these are still issues, though clearly delineated, certainly are difficult sometimes to apply. But just before we take a break, let me look at some of the objections first to the just war theory. And then after the break, I want to look at some of the objections to the application of it later on. And the first, of course, is the one I just mentioned a minute ago, the moral objection, especially from like pacifists who argue that it's never right to go to war and cite passages like, for example, Jesus telling believers to turn the other cheek in Matthew 5. Or saying that those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword in Matthew 26. But again, the context of these, especially in the first section there, when you are having Jesus talking in the Sermon on the Mount, you can see that he's really admonishing individual believers not to engage in personal retaliation. In the second instance, where he told Peter to put down his sword because the gospel should not be advanced by the sword, at the same time, let's recognize that in another passage in Luke 22, Jesus actually encouraged his disciples to buy a sword to protect themselves. So you have, I think, a very clear indication that defending yourself is still appropriate. But again, in the context of both of those, we're talking to individuals, not governments. So the other objections usually have to do with the whole issue of whether or not when we are fighting a war on terrorism, whether that applies as well. And again, some have said that military actions in places like, say, Afghanistan or Iraq or other places were inappropriate. But again, you have to understand this idea of the just war predates the idea of modern states. So just because we are now going into a group where there are terrorists, and in some respects they may or may not receive the sponsorship of the government, does not mean that we cannot use the just war criteria. As a matter of fact, the first use of American military force after the United States was formed was military use ordered by then President Thomas Jefferson against the Barbary pirates, really all the way to the shores of Tripoli, which of course you would recognize from the song for the Marines. And again, critics argue that since terrorism is an international threat, the concept of just war should be an international declaration of war. And interestingly enough, even though we didn't have technically an international declaration of war, you do have both President George Herbert Walker Bush and then later President George W. Bush going to the United Nations for a vote which looked a lot like an actual declaration of war. So even if you think that that should take place, I think in two of the more recent activities that indeed was done. So when we come back from the break, what I want to try to do is talk about a couple of other aspects of this. That first of all, I'm going to read a piece from Judge Andrew Napolitano. It's been on the program with us before. This was written a number of years ago after President Obama decided to carry out military action against Libya, and he was very critical of that action, but also, to be fair, was also critical of some of the things that were done by George W. Bush. And so, and all the way going back to President Johnson in terms of bombing North Vietnam, President Nixon bombing Cambodia. So he wants to say, if indeed we really want to apply this idea of just war, we have, even among American presidents, some things that don't seem like they fit very well. So I thought we would at least bring that conversation to the table for a few minutes. And then Lawrence Terlazazi's been on the program with us as well. As an individual, I guess maybe he hasn't been on the program we've quoted from him, let me be clear, has written a very good piece on the idea of just war and the present crisis, how we think about this in terms of the idea of a holy war, a just war, and some of that. And since he did his master's degree on this very important subject, I thought we would quote from him as well. So we'll come back and continue our conversation on this idea of just war, all that coming up right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again talking about this idea of a just war, and now focusing on some of the possible criticisms. We already talked about a few, and I think we gave some answers. But Judge Andrew Napolitano a while back wrote about this. He was at that time, of course, complaining and criticizing, at that time, President Barack Obama sending U.S. military to bomb Libya, which he felt not only violated the Constitution, but violated something that he was convinced most people didn't know much about, and that was the idea of a just war. And so I'll skip the first paragraph, but he gets into the second paragraph by saying that Thomas Aquinas is the modern articulator of the idea that governments are required to follow the same moral principles as the rest of us. This is particularly so in the case of government that claims its source of power is the consent of the governed. And he said, St. Thomas More once put it this way: some men say the earth is round and some say it is flat. If it is round, can the king's command flatten it? And if it's flat, can the parliament make it round? And he says, of course, the answer to those questions is no. And the reason is that kings and parliaments and all governments, just like all living beings, are subject to the laws of nature. One of those laws was articulated by Thomas Aquinas and embraced by Thomas More and accepted by Thomas Jefferson and taught by many Judeo-Christian scholars, and was eventually engrafted into treaties and into American law. He says it is really the concept of the just war. In American law and culture, war to be valid, it must not only be lawful, meaning it either is declared by Congress or defensive, but it must be just. And so he goes through and talks about what is a just war, and here he gives some other comments. First, that force destroys, and there is a presumption against its use. The presumption must be to overcome by first using all peaceful and viable means and alternatives to war, and that it must be clear that these alternatives are fruitless before a war can be just. That would at least be the argument that has been used by the two presidents, George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush, that we tried to work with Saddam Hussein in both cases, and he was unmoved. The second is the cause must be just. That is, the purpose of the war must be to correct a grave, profound, and enduring public evil that directly impairs the freedom and safety of those contemplating war. A good example of that would be the war to go against Nazi Germany, to free individuals who were put under this slavery of the Third Reich and the devastation and killing that took place. Third, only a lawfully competent authority may commence the use of violence, as was, and this is his argument, which I thought was interesting, was not the case when President Johnson bombed North Vietnam, or President Nixon bombed Cambodia, or President Obama bombed Libya. He left out one because a lot of people say President Clinton bombed Bosnia. So anyway, those are some ones that, again, have surfaced over these years. He says the internal laws of the nation using military force must be crafted so that war is the public policy of the nation, not the temporary personal preference of who is running the government. Fourth, there should be a probability of success so that men and women are not sentenced to certain death for a lost cause. That might be what I think some would use now when they talk about some of the wars that have been fought in the Middle East. Then he goes on to say, fifth, the use of force must be proportionate to the harm it seeks to eradicate. Thus, no more persons may be harmed by the use of military force than is absolutely necessary to achieve the just goals of the war. And finally, the war must be fought fairly and ended quickly. And the first thing he says in his little commentary is, have you heard of these rules before? Since they're universally accepted in the West, wouldn't you expect that they'd be discussed and debated openly? Did the Congress apply these rules to any of the war in your lifetime? I'll give partial credit to some of the conversation we had back at the turn of the first century. After 2001, even in 2002, there were some things being articulated by the president, at that time George W. Bush, both in a speech to the nation and in the State of the Union address that sort of touched on that. So I'll give maybe partial credit there, but otherwise this is a conversation that has really never taken place. And then Judge Andrew Napolitano goes on to say Congress has not declared war since December 8th, 1941, but it has, from time to time, debated these principles while it permitted the president to fight unjust wars. It did so when LBJ tricked it into adopting the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, and I've mentioned that before on this program, authorizing him to bomb North Vietnam, a country that had no threats to America. It debated these values when it enacted the War Powers Act of 1973 in order to restrain Nixon from bombing Cambodia and another country that did not harm the United States. But it did not, he says, debate those principles when it authorized George W. Bush to invade Afghanistan and Iraq. Maybe not, but I will give at least some credit to the president who articulated some of that and some of the conversations that we've had around the round table, and even, Chuck Colson and others bringing some of those issues up. But he says, again, the problem with most wars is that they are more strategic and adventurous than they are just. And, of course, we recognize that Saddam Hussein posed no threat to the United States, but we have, of course, thousands of American lives that were lost in that regard. Of course, he was talking about the one in Libya, where, again, it wasn't a threat to us. And nevertheless, you can see how that plays out. So you can see that Judge Andrew Napolitano, trying to take some of these ideas of a just war, actually believes that we have violated it in a number of cases. And possibly one of the reasons we have is because not that many people know about it, but that's why we're doing this program this hour. Let me now move to Dr. Lawrence Terlizese. We have quoted some of his material and posted some of his material in the past, but he has one here called The Just War Tradition in the Present Crisis, because he also wants us to understand this idea of the just war is now unfolding in a different world. There are some that might say, well, the just war was fine back when we had conventional warfare. We live in a nuclear age. We've just come off of a Cold War. How do we think about that? I think he's got us some good ideas here. He says to apply the just war criteria, we must first of all have a reasonable assessment of the current circumstances. The Cold War era witnessed a bipolar world consisting of two colossal opponents. The end of the Cold War has brought about a demise of the strict ideological battles and has propelled the advent of cultural divisions in a multipolar world. Present and future conflicts exist across cultural lines, and that is best illustrated by a book called The Clash of Civilizations. We've talked about this before on a number of occasions. Samuel Huntington was the author of that idea, in which he says this kind of post-Cold War period is going to be one where we're going to have the rise of Muslim militancy, and of course that's exactly what we have found. People are more inclined to identify with their religious and ethnic heritage, he says, than the old ideology. The West has emerged as a global leader, leaving the rest of the world to struggle either to free itself from the West or to catch up economically and technologically. And the triumph of the West, in a sense, has created a backlash in Islamic fundamentalism, which, of course, gets us into that whole debate about how that really begins to play out in our world. Fundamentalism does not represent ancient living traditions, but a modern recreation of ancient beliefs with a particular emphasis on political conquest. These Islamic fundamentalists do not hesitate to enter into a holy war or jihad with the enemies of God at a political and military level. The tragic events, he says, of 9/11 and the continued struggle against terrorism traces back to this idea that once we have some of that, we have, again, a whole set of threat and challenges to kind of the religious beliefs and traditions, and as a result, we are feeling more and more threatened all the time by that particular issue. But he also said this cultural divide that we are seeing causes Christians to reconsider the basis of warfare, premised on the responsibilities of the state to defend civil society against the encroachments of religious extremism that fights in the name of God for a holy cause. So when we come back from the break, I want to spend just a minute talking about this idea of a holy war versus a just war, because in some respects, even as we as Christians hold to a view of a just war, some of the Muslim fundamentalists hold to a view of a holy war. And then I'll get into real quickly this whole idea of an authorized use of military force and whether or not that can actually be reconciled with the Constitution and even with international law. So again, if you find yourself wanting to know a little bit more about this idea of just war, we've posted articles in the past on our website. My book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, has a chapter at the end on government and civil disobedience. I have a section dealing with the idea of just war and even some of the criticisms, which I've just mentioned, of a just war theory on how that would be applied, especially in this modern world where the greatest threat sometimes is from terrorist groups, although I'm not minimizing the threat from Russia, China, Iran, and a variety of other groups as well, and various nations. But it does change the equation, and as a result, something we need to think about if we're going to apply these principles. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Progressive pastor Doug Padgett recently wrote an article for The Hill which he titled, "Evangelicals Are No Longer a Sure Bet for Trump." This is wishful thinking on his part. A column in The New Yorker sheds light on Pastor Padgett's efforts to attract Christian support for Democrat candidates. In her piece, Teaching Democrats to Speak Evangelical, Eliza Griswold explains, Doug Padgett launched an organization called Vote Common Good to tap into the religious left's disappointment over Hillary Clinton's loss in 2016. Post-election statistics showed candidate Clinton failed to woo religious voters, with the drop-off especially sharp among evangelicals. So, for the 2018 midterms, Doug Padgett and 14 other members of Vote Common Good held political/religious revival meetings across the country in support of Democrat candidates. Vote Common Good also trains candidates in speaking to evangelicals. At a gathering of candidates in D.C., the organization's political director, Rob Ryers, advised his audience that, quote, trying to memorize John 3:16 in the car on your way to the event and then quote that is probably not the best way to connect with faith-based voters. Neither is being wrong on important moral issues. In her New Yorker piece, Ms. Griswold writes, the exodus of religious voters from the Democratic Party over the past several decades is typically explained by the culture wars, most notably over abortion. But Doug Padgett and his group aren't buying it. He says voters need to be courted. Does he really expect to convince evangelicals to support candidates whose party allows little or no deviation from pro-abortion, secular progressive dogma? Remember, Bill Clinton touted his motto for making abortion safe, legal, and rare. In 2016, Hillary dropped the word rare. Courting evangelicals must include a robust defense of the sanctity of human life. Evangelicals speak that leaves this out is not believable. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about the idea of a just war. And one of the other criticisms, it's more of a rhetorical criticism, but it's worth mentioning, is when you call this a just war, it's really a holy war, because you're actually saying that God has actually called you to do that. And I would certainly say that in the Old Testament, you could say some cases in which God did call for a military action, but nobody's really calling for that. And in this piece by Lawrence Trulizese, he makes a distinction between just war and a holy war. As a matter of fact, he even uses a quote from Roland Baton when I was at Yale University. He was up there teaching at the Yale Divinity School at that time. And of course, he's written on this subject of just war as well. Christian Attitudes Towards War and Peace is a book came out many years ago, but he said, we'd be better if whenever we're talking about war, we leave God out of it. And I think that's exactly what is happening here. These idea of just war principles don't have to necessarily be just Christian principles. They are articulated by individuals that have Christian compassion, but they can be applied in a secular state. And Lawrence Terlization makes a distinction between a holy war and just war beliefs. He says holy war fights for divine causes in crusades and jihads to punish infidels and heretics and promote a particular faith. A just war fights for political causes to defend liberty and religious freedom. A holy war fights by divine command issued from clerics and religious leaders. A just war fights through moral sanction. Holy war employs a heavenly mandate. Just war is a state mandate. Holy war is unlimited or total. Anything goes, and the enemy must be eradicated by genocide or brought to submission. A holy war slogan is kill them all and let God sort them out. You ever heard that phrase? Yes. A holy war accepts one group's claim to absolute justice and goodness, which causes them to regard others as absolutely evil. On the other hand, a just war practices limited war. It seeks to achieve limited temporal objectives and uses only necessary force to accomplish its task. Just war rejects genocide as a legitimate goal. Holy war fights out of unconditional obedience to faith. Just war fights out of obedience to the state, which is never uncontestable. Holy war fights offensive wars of conquest. Just war fights defensive wars, generally responding to provocation. Holy war battles for God to enforce belief and compel submission. Just war defends humanity in protecting civil society, which, despite its transitory and mundane role, nevertheless, in the eternal scheme of things, plays an essential part of preserving humanity from barbarism and allows everything else in history to exist. So these are some things we've talked about in terms of just war, but since we haven't had a war declared since December 8th, 1941, we now are in a world where instead there are these AUMFs. This is authorization of the use of military force. And so this has been implemented on a number of occasions, especially in some of the things that we have done in the Middle East. And there has been an attempt to push back also with some of that by either refining the authorizations or actually going to the War Powers Act of 1973. As I mentioned before, this was something that was implemented when Richard Nixon was president. It was something that was passed by Congress. Richard Nixon vetoed it, and Congress overrode its veto, but nevertheless, in many cases, we've had individuals that have simply ignored it, even though it's been on the books. And two examples that I gave earlier, Bill Clinton, the bombing campaign in Kosovo or Bosnia, and then, of course, President Obama's action in Libya. But at least it has, if you will, a resource to say that the president is supposed to notify Congress within 48 days of committing armed forces to military action, forbids armed forces from remaining for more than 60 days with a 30-day withdrawal notice. It's on the books. It has rarely been used, and even more recently, sometimes you get a non-binding action in that regard. But there is certainly a need to recognize that although the president, as commander-in-chief, does have the authority to go and use military force, and that has been used by George Herbert Walker Bush, by Bill Clinton, by George W. Bush, by Barack Obama, and by now Donald Trump. Nevertheless, those are actions that in some respects are used either for prevention, the taking out of an individual that might attack against us, and that could be, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi or Qasem Soleimani, or if in a sense some kind of retaliation when we were able to take out Osama bin Laden. But a lot of people say, well, how does this fit also with the Constitution? He's the commander-in-chief. Sometimes the commander-in-chief has to take action. when Congress has trouble even coming to a conclusion on really important issues, we can't wait for Congress to act. So we understand the importance of that. But the other big issue, of course, is how does this fit with international law? And in most cases, this is something, again, that is brought before the United Nations, if we're talking about Desert Shield or Desert Storm, or is at least brought up for something that was authorized under the authorization of the use of military force. In the case of many of these cases, the killing took place either in a foreign country, and that certainly happened with Osama bin Laden, who actually was killed in Pakistan, or Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in Iraq, and he's originally from Iran. But if indeed there was an authorization of military force, many people believe that that is justifiable. And the argument could easily be made that if indeed we are convinced that this is something that is inappropriate, then there is a place to remove that authorization of force. And if indeed some action really does violate international law, we take those individuals to the court, to The Hague, and actually prosecute some of those war crimes, as we have done from some of the people there in Bosnia and other areas as well. So as we wind down, let me mention again that we have been today looking at this idea of a just war theory. And just to summarize again, it should have a just cause, a just intention. It should be a use of last resort. There should be a formal declaration, and there should be limited objectives. And then, as we are engaged in military combat, two other factors are important: proportionate means and non-combatant immunity. And so these are, if you will, some of the fundamental ideas of just war, first articulated by Augustine and then later refined by Aquinas and used by a variety of others. And it is, I think, a very important way to begin to think about the use of military force. And if nothing else, as I can come to a conclusion here, we mentioned more than once that we have not had a formal declaration of war since actually World War II. I think if we want to obey the Constitution before and if and before, probably we will have some kind of need for a military action sometime in the future, I think it should be compelling that Congress actually have a formal declaration of war. This authorization of the use of military force, which has been open-ended, has been criticized, and I think rightly so. There is a place certainly for the commander-in-chief, the president, to actually exercise authority. But at the same time, these checks and balances instituted by the framers also would help us keep within line of some of the ideas we've talked about in this idea of a just war theory. If you'd like to know a little bit more, Kiss, we have all sorts of material on our website, but I might mention my book as well, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, which looks at a variety of social and moral issues. One of those, of course, is the issue of government, civil disobedience, and just war. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, but I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today about just war, and we'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our weekend edition, and what a week it has been. So we're going to certainly be talking about a lot of very important issues. A little bit later, we'll get back into some of the economic news that we oftentimes open with. Dow Jones broke 29,000 for the first time ever. We were talking about just a week or two ago what has happened last decade, from 11,000 to 29,000. That's pretty amazing. 145,000 jobs created and added in December. So we will come back to that, but we, especially this week, have had all sorts of back and forth on the taking out of Major General Qasem Soleimani. So I wanted to hear from everybody involved here, and we, of course, have Penna Dexter with us, as we always do, Lathan Watts, who is with First Liberty. But we also wanted to, and I've been promoting this for a couple of days now, are privileged to have joining us by phone Gary Bauer, who, of course, served as the chief domestic policy advisor under Ronald Reagan, is the president of American Values. And Gary Bauer, we have a few things to talk about, don't we?
We sure do, Kerby, and I hope you appreciate the fact that here in Washington we provide you with a daily list of subject matter for your show.
Well, and it's not just Washington. Let's go to Hollywood and all to our progressive, and I'm putting this in quotes, friends, who were saying that the taking out of Qasem Soleimani was inappropriate because, after all, he's a poet and he's a diplomat, and he was there on a diplomatic mission, and he was assassinated by the president, who is guilty of war crimes, and we just dodged World War III. Did I check all the boxes? I think I checked most of the boxes. Gary Bauer, what do you think about all the things we've been hearing all week?
You know, I almost began to feel a little ill just hearing you go down the list. Look, there's differences in America between conservatives and liberals and Republicans and Democrats, but one would hope, even at a time like this, that when it comes to somebody with as much blood on his hands as Soleimani had, and when we see in our own communities the results of his handiwork, whether it's the graves of U.S. soldiers that came back in a casket from Iraq or Afghanistan, or the men and women we see who've lost their legs or their arms, you would think that any true blue, red-blooded American would say, well, I disagree with President Trump on a lot, but he did the world a favor today when he eliminated this murderer. But as you pointed out, Kerby, it was quite the opposite. Chris Matthews, the commentator, went through a remarkable explanation. He said, in every society there are people that are revered, like Lady Diane in Great Britain, or in our country culturally, the death of Elvis or the death of Martin Luther King. And we need to understand that Soleimani was the same type of figure in Iran. I mean, I felt like it was a parody show, but no, it was actually Chris Matthews.
Gary, is Penna, thank you so much for being with us today. I just, I'm watching the Democrats with this. I think this was inconvenient for a lot of Democrats because now they're having to look like they don't care about taking care of someone who has caused so much damage. And, as much as they're now trying to find a reason to condemn Trump for this and to say that there was not an imminent threat to our embassy, I just don't know how true a lot of this is ringing throughout even their party. What do you think?
I share your confusion about this and not quite knowing what do people really feel about this? Now, I served in government during the Reagan years, and anytime something happened in which the left was this ridiculous in their reaction, the public was always overwhelmingly on our side. I mean, by 80-20 margins. But I've seen some polls in the last couple of days that showed that only one poll said that 47% of the American people said the president did the right thing by neutralizing Soleimani, and 40% thought he did the wrong thing. And I mean, I know the country has changed, but I find that hard to believe, and I wonder if the polls are distorted. I just think most Americans, Republican or Democrat, know evil when they see it, and would be glad that somebody that had this kind of a record and who was dedicated to continuing to bring pain and suffering to us, to Israel, and to anybody in the Middle East that yearned for freedom or wanted a better life.
Mr. Bauer, Lathan Watts, thanks for being here with us. And I wanted to just sort of build off of that point that Penna made and that you just made, that those who are criticizing the action are referring to lots of things about international law and this sorts of thing, and they keep glossing over the fact that Soleimani himself had been labeled a terrorist by international bodies and was in violation of international. He was not ever supposed to leave the nation of Iran.
Yes, exactly right. It has been strange to see these legal cases being made. What were we supposed to do? Read him his rights, before we fired the drone. And look, I've come to think, and as time has gone on, that I wish we would return to the days when, before America went into a long-term major war with an adversary, that we would take it to the Congress and get a declaration of war, because that way the Congress will have bought into it, and there will be no second-guessing about it. And it seems to me that's a good thing to do. But any time in our history, we've always had the principle that when the country faced an imminent threat, or when a low-key war was being waged against us through terrorism, that the President of the United States, any President of the United States, had constitutional authority to act in order to save American lives. And that's exactly what the President did in this case, and quite frankly, what Barack Obama did a number of times during his presidency. So this idea that after what the Congress has done to the President in the last several years, that the President should call up Adam Schiff as head of the Intelligence Committee or Nancy Pelosi and say, do I have your permission to take out this terrorist? I mean, the terrorists would, in my view, have known about the impending attack before the President would have gotten an answer from some of these people on Capitol Hill.
He did have kind of a funny little discussion about that yesterday in the Ohio conversation that he had with a number of his supporters. But again, even if you called Nancy Pelosi, we found out as we talked the other day, she didn't answer the phone when Mike Pence called. So that is the case. But as we're going to a break, and we'll come back and get some more from Gary Bauer, one of the things we posted earlier in the week was from Alan Dershowitz, and I know Gary has quoted that as well, making the case that, first of all, this was constitutional because, after all, the president is the commander-in-chief, and we find that in Article 2 of the Constitution. Lathan reads his Constitution. Matter of fact, everybody around the table does, but a lot of people don't. And in terms of international law, if nothing else, this was actually taking place in Iraq, and we have an authorization use of military force. And one other comment that I thought was really good by Alan Dershowitz, if we had no problem with, of course, taking out Osama bin Laden, that at best could be called an action of retaliation, whereas the taking out of Qasem Soleimani would be an act of prevention. So, if anything, that would be more justifiable. Anyway, we'll continue with Gary Bauer right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The longest impact a president can make on the country is through the federal judges he appoints to the court. After 3 years in office, President Trump has appointed and has confirmed more federal judges than previous presidents in the last few decades. The highest court below the Supreme Court is the Circuit Court. More than a quarter of the U.S. Circuit Court judges are Trump nominees. Let's put this in perspective. President Obama appointed and confirmed 55 Circuit Court judges by the end of his 8 years in office. Already, President Trump has appointed and confirmed 50 judges to the Circuit Court benches. The Trump appointments have already flipped 3 Circuit Courts to majority Republican-appointed judges. These courts will be hearing significant cases involving a wide range of issues. Remember that very few court cases, probably about 70 or 80, ever reach the Supreme Court. The decisions rendered by these circuit courts establish precedents and have a significant influence in laws and policies. Overall, President Trump has installed a total of 187 federal judges, most of whom are young and will likely serve a very long time. Moreover, most of these judges hold to a belief in originalism, meaning they interpret the Constitution according to its original intent. The editors of the Wall Street Journal explain why this is good. They said a new era of originalism in the court should be good for the law and for the public reputation of the judiciary as a nonpartisan interpreter of the Constitution. Such an era may even be good for progressives who will have to win their arguments the old-fashioned way, via political debate and elections. I agree that this new era will be good for America because it will be based on the proper interpretation of the Constitution. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, and we're back once again. Penna Dexter with us, as she always is, and also, of course, Lathan Watts of First Liberty. Let me just give you a program note. We're talking at the moment with our good friend Gary Bauer, who is the president of American Values. A little bit later, we'll get into Penna Dexter's commentary about teaching evangelicals speak. I love this because there are some of these so-called progressive evangelicals there. Also, we posted the piece by Eric Metaxas, The Christian Case for Trump, and I know that Gary Bauer was at that meeting, but before we do so, aren't we supposed to have an impeachment trial, Penna Dexter? What's going on here?
Maybe, and that's what I want to ask Gary about, because Gary, Nancy Pelosi says soon I'll send the articles over. I will not hold on to them indefinitely. And Mitch McConnell is saying to senators now, don't plan on going home next weekend. But still, no one really knows what will happen. Do you think, will he go ahead and just start the trial regardless of what Nancy Pelosi does with the articles?
Well, the hot rumor around town this afternoon is that she will send the impeachment documents ahead to the Senate next week. I think, as we saw this week, cracks beginning to form among the Democrats in Congress, as well as even some of the reporters were getting irritated at what the strategy was here. So I don't think McConnell is going to have to go on and take an initiative on his own on this. I think the battle will be joined probably in a couple of days. It is amazing, though. In fact, one member of Congress, I forget now which one it was speculating that maybe she hasn't sent it forward because she's not sure where the Senate is actually located. So he put up a little video today of him doing the walk from her office to the Senate and sort of mapping it out for her. So she's almost becoming a joke about this. And so I think over the weekend she'll make her shift and probably send it forward as early as possible next week.
Gary, it just seems like she really and truly does not want to do this. She stepped forward and went ahead and I think thought maybe public opinion would start building around their position, but it just hasn't materialized, has it?
It hasn't, and it's been a bizarre thing to watch. I mean, first of all, as we all know, the rules that they followed in the House were terrible. If in any kind of a trial or a grand jury proceeding in the United States outside of an impeachment proceeding had followed these kinds of rules, as soon as the case was appealed to a higher court, the court would overturn the whole process. As you know, they wouldn't let the Republicans have the witnesses that they wanted. They did a lot of the hearings behind closed doors and didn't share the transcripts with their colleagues. The list goes on and on. But then after that's all over and they get the vote that they want, suddenly she's trying to direct Senator McConnell what rules he has to follow in the United States Senate. And I think this was a great gift for Senator McConnell because for the last week plus, he was able to go to the floor of the Senate and say, excuse me, Speaker Pelosi, you're not a senator. You don't get to tilt the rules in the House of Representatives and then browbeat us to change our rules in the United States Senate.
And one of the things I was thinking about, let me come to our lawyer here. If I look at my Constitution here, it says that the House has the sole power of impeachment and the Senate has the sole power to try impeachments. And this is the idea of checks and balances. We constituted two different chambers, bicameral chambers, because of this idea of checks and balances, right?
That's exactly right. And just like Gary said, I was expecting McConnell to quote the Geico commercial, but that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. And he stopped just short of that. But I'm interested also in your opinion, Mr. Bauer, if she does end up sending those articles over, if you have heard there in Washington about any talk of who the House managers will be.
I have not heard specifics on that. A lot of rumors, but it keeps changing from day to day. I just think it's amazing that they've gotten themselves in this situation. I mean, there's the public watched this. If anything, it's strengthened the president. And of course, this week we got a very timely reminder of how dangerous the world is, and that we have enemies, and that there are people that want us divided. And here we are in an election year in which in just, a few months, 10 months or so, the American people will be able to judge for themselves whether they want to give President Trump 4 more years or whether they want to change who's in the Oval Office. And so to put the country through this, it seems to me it can only be explained in one way, that for political gain, Pelosi and the others were willing to further divide the country and exacerbate the deep divisions that already exist, knowing that an impeachment process would do exactly that, but they thought it would benefit them on Election Day. And that's a terrible thing to do. I think a lot of us are worried that the country has deep divisions, and we shouldn't do anything to make those more severe or to fester more and to put us more at risk to the hands of our enemies.
Well, Gary, we're going to just switch since we don't have much time left before you have to leave us. But you were at the meeting of evangelicals with the president last week, and it's and I've been thinking about the sort of liberal to moderate Christians, a la Mark Galli and Christianity Today, and how can they actually pretend that this isn't a moral issue, that just the president's personality or the way he's acted in the past isn't way less important than big issues like religious liberty and abortion and things that face the country. And so I imagine, I don't know how it was to be together with all those Christians, but I can imagine that people were scratching their heads sort of about the CT types that are out there.
Well, it was something that people chatted about and shook their heads about. we're supposed to be gentle as lambs and as wise as serpents. And, I think back to Jimmy Carter, who was, by his own description, a born-again Christian, and yet he was, by anybody's measurement, a terrible president. He was unable to make decisions. He had a naive view about the world. In fact, since Iran's in the news, he sat by while Iran took over our embassy in Tehran, took hostages and held them for 444 days, and seemed totally unable to come up with an answer about how to deal with that. So there are times when I can certainly imagine having the choice between a Christian candidate that just doesn't have the skills to be president or has strange views about issues, and a candidate that is not a Christian but is right on the sanctity of life and on religious liberty and on many, many other issues that we care about. So, I think we all would love to have fellow believers in every elected office, but I think we always have to be wise in how we choose. And if Donald Trump's opponent had won 3 years ago, or if we swing left in 11 months here, just about everything that Christians care about are going to be in deep trouble in the months that follow. So I don't think this should be that difficult of a decision to make. As far as the president's history and whether he's made mistakes and whether we wish he would have done things, of course. The old saying is that every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. And that's, I think, good advice as we're looking at the rough world of politics.
Let me just mention that we have a link to Gary Bauer's ministry and outreach and organization. And matter of fact, the most recent end-of-day report is something we've been talking about. There's my booklet on anti-Semitism. I know that you've served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and speaking of that issue, and you've even spoken out about this whole issue of anti-Semitism. So that's another issue we've been following. So first of all, you can go to ouramericanvalues.org. You can get the end-of-day report. You can find some of the videos that are available there. But most importantly, we encourage you to subscribe. And if you are interested in all the things that we have been talking about and will continue to talk about when Gary leaves us, you might want to go to his website there as well. So, Gary, thank you, as always, for being our eyes and ears up there in Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us today on our weekend edition.
Kirby, Penna, Lathan, it's great to be with all of you. Have a fantastic weekend and keep up the good fight.
When we come back, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how Congress reacted. The War Powers Act, and that's one of our articles there. Also, some questions about impeachment, and then we'll get into this issue about the so-called Christian case for Trump. And there are a number of very significant religious liberty issues, a victory, and a couple of other hearings that have been heard. And so we've got a lot to cover. And so if you would like to join the conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation with Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts, right after these important messages.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts with us as well. And let me try to put some of this in context. We earlier in the week said that Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, was going to call for a vote on a War Powers Resolution, which is different than the War Powers Act. Again, we've talked about this, but the War Powers Act was passed in 1973 to limit what Richard Nixon would do when he wanted to bomb Cambodia. The law actually requires that the president have to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing military forces, that those forces can only remain for 60 days with maybe a withdrawal period of an additional 30 days. Without a congressional authorization use of military force. Richard Nixon vetoed it. Congress passed it, overrode his veto, and then subsequently a lot of presidents, that would be Bill Clinton, a bombing campaign in Kosovo, that might be President Barack Obama bombing Libya, and you can mention some others, simply ignored it. But there is now the attempt to actually pass a War Powers Resolution. But I do love this one out of the Wall Street Journal. Fans of the movie Animal House will recall the scene where the brothers of Delta House declare that it's time for really futile and stupid gesture. House Democrats chose to do something similar. Lathan Watts, sounds like you wrote that one.
I wish I had.
It is such a great line. What do we think about this? This is a non-binding War Powers Resolution that doesn't have anything in common with laws on the books. What's your thoughts?
Well, the quote from Animal House, this is going to take a truly futile and stupid gesture. And the next line is one of the brothers stands up and says, and we're just the men to do it. and I feel like that's exactly what Nancy Pelosi thought. We're just the folks to do it.
Yeah.
There's zero legal authority to a non-binding resolution. It has the legal effect of a Facebook post. I mean, this is the equivalent of Nancy Pelosi going on Facebook and saying, I think Donald Trump didn't have the authority to do this. Like and share if you agree. And all the Democrat caucus getting on there and clicking like. That's what it is. It has no legal authority whatsoever. If they were really serious about the War Powers Act, they would have brought up the War Powers Act and either amended it, revoked it, changed it, whatever they wanted to do, send it over to the Senate, let them, then it comes back for a conference period, then send it to the president.
You look at, there was a meeting to explain all of this, and then you had Mike Lee and Rand Paul, two senators, wanting a little bit upset in the way it was explained, and yet the way you talk about this now, Lathan, it makes me realize that they're serious senators. They want to deal with congressional discussion of going to war, but this was something different, and they would not have, if they'd been in the House, they wouldn't have supported this particular unserious statement in one sense that really had no legal meaning. They wouldn't have supported that. So people are coming back and saying, well, Senator Lee would vote for this. No, he wouldn't. He would vote for something different in the U.S. Senate. There is a case to be made for discussion when you're taking the step of going to war. And first of all, this wasn't going to war. I think it's going to have a real deterrent to war in the long run. But secondly, they're making so many arguments right now that I think it's hard. Some of this is hard to explain to the public, and the media certainly isn't doing that.
Yeah, and the decision to go to war, as it has been described, and I think you're right. I don't believe that Donald Trump made the decision to go to war.
No.
He made the decision to kill a terrorist, and he had the opportunity. He did so. A man who was responsible for the deaths of American soldiers and the maiming of American soldiers was mentioned earlier by Mr. Bauer. We do live in sort of a time period where America's enemies don't put on uniforms and invade countries like they used to. So the constitutional prescription of requiring a declaration of war, it still applies, and it can still be done. But I do see, and like Penna mentioned, you're seeing a lot of conversation on both sides of the aisle about how to deal with this now, when the enemy is not necessarily declaring war on you or acting, in a way that signifies, the beginning of a war. I mean, Japan didn't declare war on us; they just bombed Pearl Harbor, right? And then we declared war on them. But that's a country taking a military action with their official military against another country. Whereas, what we're seeing now is, and I think in some of the debate is, okay, so how do we deal with the current situation?
Right.
And yes, there may still be times when it is, an official military action of a country against us, and if so, the president should come to Congress and ask for a declaration of war and go deal with it.
Yeah.
But there are lots of other threats out there that don't involve uniformed personnel. Gary Bauer talked about the support that Ronald Reagan had, and I think some of that is due to the sort of clear-eyed, moral clarity that Reagan had when it came to things like this. I mean, he was asked about his philosophy on the Cold War, and he said, "It's simple: we win, they lose."
Yeah.
And even President George W. Bush, after September 11th, he said, "We're not going to differentiate between the people who did this and the countries who supported them, or who enabled them to do it." And he had a lot of support for that philosophy. I don't know in the current political climate if you would have similar support for that sort of philosophy, but I think if President Trump announced something similar and said Soleimani was acting at the very least with the knowledge of his government and probably with the encouragement and approval of his government.
For sure, yeah.
And, we do not distinguish between acts of terrorism and the states that supported them, and therefore I retaliated.
Yeah. Well, and again, as you point out, we haven't had a declaration of war since December 8th, 1941, but we have had these authorizations of the use of military force, AUMFs. And the argument being made right now is the 2001 AUMF was to have George W. Bush take out Saddam Hussein. I think that happened a while ago. So there are some that have suggested that, and this is something that the Democrats could have done because last year you had 215 House Democrats voted for an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill expressing, of course, again, the sense of Congress that the 2001 AUMF has been utilized beyond its scope. And so if we want Congress to act, then Congress needs to act with something other than this non-binding resolution, which Lathan said is kind of like a Facebook post. I think I'm going to see a Lathan video on this pretty soon. What do you think?
I think so. Yes, and so the current AUMF is now in force in Iraq, and this happened in Iraq. So there you go.
End of the discussion. That's why Alan Dershowitz said this is not unconstitutional. It fits into Article 2 of the Commander-in-Chief. And who is the Commander-in-Chief of the military forces? Well, when the framers wrote this, what are they thinking in the front of their mind? Not the back of the front of their mind. George Washington, because they were pretty sure he'd probably be the president. And since then, we've had other generals, Andrew Jackson, Dwight Eisenhower. But even if we've had a civilian in office, we still recognize that's part of the executive branch. But the framers also said somewhere along the line, Congress has to do something. So in Article 1, it also says that Congress has the right to declare war. I think Congress also has the right to pull funds if all of a sudden you have, let me go take a previous president, Barack Obama, bombing Libya, and you go, why are we doing this? And what are we doing this for? Then you could pull the funds for that. And that's, I think, the checks and balance that was intended by the Constitution, don't you think?
Certainly. And you mentioned the War Powers Act and these authorizations of military force. Congress did this in Vietnam.
They did.
A lot of people forget about this, but the U.S. supporting South Vietnam had basically driven the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table and brought them. I mean, the bombing campaign was working, and we were actually winning. This is very different than what you will see in any movie about Vietnam, any history book about Vietnam. And negotiating over a ceasefire, and Congress would not authorize additional funds that Nixon wanted,
right,
to continue helping the South Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese saw that for what it was, an act of, that we wanted out, and pulled away, invaded, and the rest is history. So, I mean, there are consequences to pulling funding
Yes.
sometimes, but it is, the power of the purse is invested in Congress for a reason.
Yeah. Well, if nothing else, this has caused us to think about War Powers Act and authorization of use of military force and all the rest. But if you are listening online or want to go online right now, Penna Dexter's commentary, Teaching Evangelical Speak. And when we come back, we'll talk about this because there are some that are saying, let's see if we can get more evangelicals to vote for the Democrat. And I think you, as you listen to this, will begin to understand a little bit more about what's happening behind the scenes, which then, of course, brings us into the meeting that took place last week. And Kelly Shackelford was there, Gary Bauer was there, and a lot of others with President Trump. So we'll talk about that right after these messages.
Progressive pastor Doug Padgett recently wrote an article for The Hill which he titled, "Evangelicals Are No Longer a Sure Bet for Trump." This is wishful thinking on his part. A column in The New Yorker sheds light on Pastor Padgett's efforts to attract Christian support for Democrat candidates. In her piece, Teaching Democrats to Speak Evangelical, Eliza Griswold explains, Doug Padgett launched an organization called Vote Common Good to tap into the religious left's disappointment over Hillary Clinton's loss in 2016. Post-election statistics showed candidate Clinton failed to woo religious voters, with the drop-off especially sharp among evangelicals. So, for the 2018 midterms, Doug Padgett and 14 other members of Vote Common Good held political/religious revival meetings across the country in support of Democrat candidates. Vote Common Good also trains candidates in speaking to evangelicals. At a gathering of candidates in D.C., the organization's political director, Rob Ryers, advised his audience that, quote, trying to memorize John 3:16 in the car on your way to the event and then quote that is probably not the best way to connect with faith-based voters. Neither is being wrong on important moral issues. In her New Yorker piece, Ms. Griswold writes, the exodus of religious voters from the Democratic Party over the past several decades is typically explained by the culture wars, most notably over abortion. But Doug Padgett and his group aren't buying it. He says voters need to be courted. Does he really expect to convince evangelicals to support candidates whose party allows little or no deviation from pro-abortion, secular progressive dogma? Remember, Bill Clinton touted his motto for making abortion safe, legal, and rare. In 2016, Hillary dropped the word rare. Courting evangelicals must include a robust defense of the sanctity of human life. Evangelical speak that leaves this out is not believable. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you were listening to Point of View on your computer or something like that, or even on the smartphone on our app, you heard Penna Dexter's commentary right now, Teaching Evangelical Speak. If not, it is available right now on our website. You can just go scroll down and find it there. But also, I might encourage you, if you don't get the Viewpoints commentary, sign up for it, and it will arrive in your inbox tomorrow. But, Penna, you've been researching the Vote Common Good group, and there have been various people saying, because of the CT editorial, the Christianity Today editorial, maybe a lot of evangelicals are leaving Donald Trump. I don't see any evidence of that, but this is kind of the hope of some of these individuals you were writing about.
Yeah, there are a couple others. I interviewed Peter Wehner recently. I read Michael Gerson in the Washington Post, and these are never-Trumper Christian, quote-unquote, Republicans. And people like this are saying, we need to get more Democrats, more religious left types, and to vote for the Democrats, not to oppose Donald Trump because he's just so bad. And we don't like his personality, we don't like his tweets, and we don't like how he operated, 20 years ago. And what kind of a husband he was at that time. Things like that. So, I just have to ask the question, what's your great moral issue if you are a Christian encouraging people to vote Democrat? Is your issue climate change? Is that the greatest moral issue for the church? Is it bringing in more illegal immigrants? Is it bringing in more refugees from terrorist countries? So if those are your issues, if you care a lot about human rights or whatever, you probably do care about the unborn too. And the unborn, the issue of abortion is such an important issue that to say that you support a Democrat, you cannot be trying to protect the sanctity of human life, because there are no Democrats that do anymore. There used to be some pro-life Democrats, as was pointed out in Eric Metaxas' wonderful piece in the Wall Street Journal, The Christian Case for Trump. No more, no longer. Even as recently as the 1990s, when Clinton was there, and he wanted abortion to mean safe, legal, and rare. Hillary dropped the rare part in her campaign. And so you cannot be pro-life and be a Democrat if it's only on that issue. But also look back and see what happened under Obama. Marriage was destroyed. The definition of marriage officially was destroyed. Religious liberty was attacked from every corner. So these things that most Christians, really across the board, care about are so important now that I think that it would just be logically difficult to even try to encourage Christians to support most Democrat candidates, especially most of the ones we see out there now. Mm-hmm. So Eric Metaxas made a great case for the Christian Case for Trump to refute what Mark Gawley wrote in Christianity Today, and I commend it to people. It's at pointofview.net.
Might just mention it's the third article, and some of the articles at the Wall Street Journal are kind of only shortly provided, and so you have to have a subscription. Well, Penna has a subscription, I do, so we have the entire article so you can read it. I had some people saying, I tried to read it, but I only got past the first paragraph.
You can't link to it. You have to go to pointofview.net.
And so we did provide that. Of course, there's one by Tony Perkins that came out in the stream after the meeting there in Florida. And so if you want to find some articles that might be things that you would use, or articles that you would want to post on your Facebook page or Twitter, or just read and say, okay, I'm just really going to want to think about this, that would be the case. And, of course, Penna Dexter's commentary is talking about those who are just saying, well, there is a real movement, or there's an attempt to bring a real movement of evangelical voters away from Donald Trump. And if I can add one more, my commentary today is about the federal judges. It's something we talked about before, but I put all the facts and figures in before we add new judges. And I talk about not only the number, the quantity, but also the quality, because you're talking about how qualified these individuals are and how they're originalists, and also their age, how young they are, and how they're going to influence not just your children, but your grandchildren. So, Lathan, there are a few compelling arguments. Whatever you think about the personality of the president, the actions have been pretty significant.
Certainly in the arena of judges that you just mentioned, if for nothing else, and their interpretation of the Constitution and their record for defending religious liberty. I think that for a lot of conservative voters who consider themselves Christian of one stripe or another, I think many of them did have a major sort of crisis of conscience over whether or not to vote for Donald Trump the first time. And I think a lot of it probably was sort of rooted in what they knew about him as a person, about his character, about his marriages, other things. And I think for a lot of them, it felt it might seem like that they were being hypocritical if they voted for him after criticizing a lot of people who voted for Bill Clinton, knowing what they knew about Bill Clinton, and that they were hearing a lot of the things that Democrats said about Bill Clinton and his character versus, well, he supports the policies I want, so I'm going to vote for him. And many people felt like they were being asked to do the same thing with Trump. Ignore the person, focus on the policy. And that's, that has been out there about this president. Mm-hmm. And so, honestly, I don't have a bone to pick with those who said, I can't vote for this guy. Now, I don't think a lot of those people voted for Hillary Clinton. I think they probably just left the top of the ballot blank and continued voting down the rest of the ballot. But what I think you will see in this next election is that now a lot of those people that made that decision the first time, I think many more of them will vote for him for re-election, even though they didn't vote for him to be elected, because they have now lived, by the time we vote, 4 years with the policy that he's put in place. And now they have, much more of a record, like on judges, like on the life issue, like on religious liberty, lots of things that Penna mentioned that traditional conservative and Christian voters care about. So I actually think he will end up with, if I had to predict, I think he will end up with more of the evangelical vote this time than he got last time.
One of the things I noticed during the 2016 campaign was, yes, a lot of people, he was like a lot of people's last choice. And then, of course, he was ahead in the polls almost the whole time. I think the whole time. And so people saw that writing on the wall there. And then he came out with his list for judicial nominees. And that was brilliant. I don't know if he knew how brilliant it was, but when we had Carrie Severino from Judicial Confirmation Network, Judicial Crisis Network, I always call it confirmation. It's actually crisis. And she was talking about sort of that decision-making for that happening. And it really did change things, because people that were paying attention to religious liberty and the bad attacks that were taking place know that the courts are where you have constitutional power to fix that if you bring these cases. So the judges were so important. And I knew a lot of people who said, and the people that I really respect spiritually and also politically, who said, it's because of the judges. I'm going to vote for him because of that, because of the Supreme Court and the other courts. And so they switched because of that. And then, the rest is history. We've seen so many of the issues and concerns of Christians be handled in a way that's made Christians pleased and happy. And it's been done at, I think, a great expense. This has been tough to do for this president. And so I think you're right, Lathan. I think you're going to see more, not less.
I think so.
Support
yes. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We're also going to talk about some of those religious liberty cases. But Penna Dexter's commentary today, Teaching Evangelicals Speak. My commentary today is also there, Federal Judges, which I say the longest impact a president ever makes are those judges. And look at the number that actually have been confirmed and more to come. We'll take a break. And we'll take some of your calls right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour in our weekend edition, Penna Dexter and Lathan Watts will be talking about religious liberty, but a little bit later we might get into the media in a couple of ways. First of all, there has been a decision coming down on the individual, Nicholas Sandmann. You might remember him, the poor boy that was completely vilified by this Native American standing in front of him. And so this is a decision coming down on CNN, so I want to talk about what that might mean. Also, while we're talking about the media, did Twitter help stop the war with Iran, which was in Wired by Garrett Graff, pointing out that both the foreign minister of Iran, Zavid Zarif, who, by the way, has a Ph.D. from the University of Denver in international relations and speaks English very well, puts out this Twitter post. And 16 minutes later, Donald Trump puts out his Twitter post, and it's almost like they were saying, okay, we're going to stand down. And he does a comparison of how difficult it was to communicate between Russia and the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So just a little bit of history we might get to.
Interesting.
And we might talk about the economy and a few other things. But Penna Dexter, let's see if we can, since we have Lathan Watts here, talk about, we have some other victories. And I always like to talk about the victories. So,
this was fun, Kerby,
yes,
because it actually the news came out today, and we didn't know that we would be discussing this today on Point of View. But this is from the TV station in Fredericksburg, Virginia, from Fox. The legal team for a Virginia couple, of course, that legal team is the attorneys at First Liberty Institute. They took this couple in Virginia, elderly, took the owners of their senior living apartments to court because they were conducting a Bible study there. It was banned from the public spaces, and then it was actually told to them that if they had a Bible study in their own apartment, they would be evicted. So, I mean, they fought this, and First Liberty got behind them, and they have actually won the right to come back and hold the Bible study, even in the community space there. It's great. It's a great victory. This is why you exist, isn't it?
It is, and we're very happy for Ken and Leave Hauge. That's our clients there in Fredericksburg, Virginia, retired Lutheran minister. And in fact, just this week, Wednesday night, they had their first Bible study in the community room there at the apartment complex. I think the first one in over a year, because this potential litigation had been going on for so long. And I should say, we're very pleased with the outcome. We were able to settle this without having to go to court, and all the parties involved should be commended for reaching this settlement. But the settlement does, 100% protect Ken's religious liberty, and it was a great sight to see he and his friends be able to gather in that community room just like anybody else and study the Bible together. And beyond just his First Amendment right, a lot of times this kind of gets overlooked with this story and others, because this is not the only situation like this in senior living facilities that we've dealt with.
Yeah.
Is that there were people at the apartment complex that wanted to get together and do a Bible study before Ken ever moved there. And when he moved in, when they met him and realized he was a retired minister, they asked him to lead it. A lot of people in facilities like this have issues with mobility. They don't really get out and go to church somewhere on Sunday. And so this is their opportunity to do so. So it really was certainly it was Ken who was the face of this, but it was about more than just him. And we're very happy with the outcome there for the Hauges and the others that wanted to participate in this study.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of my own dad, who's 92, and where he lives, they have church every Sunday. They have sometimes they have people's memorial services and funerals because that's where everyone is. The ones that can't drive, which is a lot of them, can just go, and it's right there. And to have that taken away from you is a big life problem. And you all solved it for the Haugies and this particular place, and I hope that it sets the tone for other cases like this.
We've also, there are stories like this one that make either local news, and sometimes our cases are make national news. We talk about those for sure, but there are other instances like this that people don't really hear about, but we found out because the person contacted us and told us. Another person who lives in that area, this was a few months ago, saw what was going on with the Haugies. I think saw an op-ed that we had published about what was going on, and this person was facing the exact same scenario in their apartment complex.
Wow.
And being told that this person couldn't do that. She printed the op-ed and went to her management, and the management was like, "Oh, okay," and so she was able to. I mean, she
there
won without some there. We love to talk about wins.
We're talking about deterrence today.
And sometimes there are wins that we're never going to know about.
That's for sure.
And that's why we do publicize these things. It's not just about getting our face on camera or getting something in print. It's because we're trying to educate the public as to what's going on, and that enables them to defend themselves.
That's good. You can go to First Liberty. By the way, when you go to First Liberty, you can find out about this case. But Penna, see that this one says Sweet Justice for Sweet Cakes. And that shows Melissa Klein. You've had a chance to hear her speak and to see her actually decorate cakes. You can see her actually decorating one right now. And that's the case out of Oregon. And that's an important one because it gets us into all sorts of other legal issues as well. And so as I understand, they've actually had an opportunity to hear some oral arguments on that.
I love Melissa Klein because she just wears her emotions on her sleeve and on her face, and she's so transparent in talking about what's happened. It's been a long battle for them, and the Supreme Court sent it back so that after Masterpiece, that decision about a bakery, a wedding vendor type case, it changed the equation for things. So it's gone back now, and apparently I'm going to let Lathan explain exactly legally what has been done. But the case has been presented again as instructed by the Supreme Court. So now this is the beginning of a trip back up there, hopefully, right?
That's exactly right. So the Oregon Court of Appeals, which originally heard our appeal of the Bureau of Labor and Industry in Oregon, their decision to impose the $135,000 fine on the Kleins. And originally the Oregon Court of Appeals upheld the Bureau's decision. And so we appealed that to the Oregon State Supreme Court, who declined to hear it. So we went to the U.S. Supreme Court, who, as you said, granted the case, vacated the Oregon Court of Appeals decision, which is basically just wipes it off the books, and remanded it back to the Oregon Court of Appeals, saying you need to hear this again in light of the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, which says, clearly government cannot be hostile to the religious beliefs of the citizens when deciding an issue like this. So yesterday we argued that case in front of the Oregon Court of Appeals again with our volunteer counsel, Adam Gustafson, who's a brilliant lawyer. And at the same time, almost the same time, on the other end of the country, we were on both coasts this week. We were arguing in Boston, Massachusetts, in front of the First Circuit Court of Appeals, a case that we're working on with Institute for Justice, challenging the state of Maine and their school choice program. In rural areas where there's not a school district, the state provides kind of a scholarship fund that families can use to pay, to go to a private school, unless you choose to send your kids to a private religious school. So we were arguing that case this week as well.
And we'll come back and talk a little bit more about those, but also take some phone calls. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We've, of course, talked about what has happened in the Middle East this week. We've talked about impeachment, and we're talking about religious liberty. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The longest impact a president can make on the country is through the federal judges he appoints to the court. After 3 years in office, President Trump has appointed and has confirmed more federal judges than previous presidents in the last few decades. The highest court below the Supreme Court is the Circuit Court. More than a quarter of the U.S. Circuit Court judges are Trump nominees. Let's put this in perspective. President Obama appointed and confirmed 55 Circuit Court judges by the end of his 8 years in office. Already, President Trump has appointed and confirmed 50 judges to the Circuit Court benches. The Trump appointments have already flipped 3 Circuit Courts to majority Republican-appointed judges. These courts will be hearing significant cases involving a wide range of issues. Remember that very few court cases, probably about 70 or 80, ever reach the Supreme Court. The decisions rendered by these circuit courts establish precedents and have a significant influence in laws and policies. Overall, President Trump has installed a total of 187 federal judges, most of whom are young and will likely serve a very long time. Moreover, most of these judges hold to a belief in originalism, meaning they interpret the Constitution according to its original intent. The editors of the Wall Street Journal explain why this is good. They said a new era of originalism in the court should be good for the law and for the public reputation of the judiciary as a nonpartisan interpreter of the Constitution. Such an era may even be good for progressives who will have to win their arguments the old-fashioned way, via political debate and elections. I agree that this new era will be good for America because it will be based on the proper interpretation of the Constitution. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking about the subject of religious liberty, and we'll move on to some other topics in just a minute. Penna Dexter and Lathan Watts. Let me take a phone call real quickly because I think it relates. Adam in California, I think you wanted to talk about this issue of religious liberties, so go for it.
Hello?
Yes, you're on the air.
Oh, hello. I just wanted to kind of paint a big picture about the religious liberty that's going on, like, people that are getting, it's hard for them to do the Bible studies and everything. And then if you take a step back and look at our government, Trump's actually surrounding himself with, some of the religious liberty, bigwigs, if you will, in his, running our government, being our president. And so he's basically doing the same thing with religious liberties in the White House that we're trying to do for Americans, or in America. And the only kickback he's getting is the state of California because they're trying to be so left. And, any president that comes far left hasn't succeeded. So I think that's the answer of a lot of prayer.
Yeah, and let's talk about that because, Lathan, I think you can speak to that. I know that Jeremy as well as Kelly can talk about that because they went to a Justice Department function, but I know you're familiar with it as well. And it seems to me that all sorts of actions by this president have protected freedom of conscience and religious liberty. Can you speak to some of that?
Certainly. I mean, they established religious liberty as a priority of this administration with an executive order. And across all federal departments. And for example, Health and Human Services created its own civil rights task force specifically to protect conscience rights of people who work in healthcare. The guy who ran that task force was named Justin Butterfield, who was
we think we know him,
former attorney from First Liberty Institute.
I just love this.
And welcome back, Justin. He's left HHS and he's coming back to First Liberty, so we're glad to have him back. He's a brilliant Harvard Law grad. But yes, I mean the Justice Department has made it a priority. The task force that then A.G. Sessions announced that was going to look into religious liberty and applying it in lots of different areas, including housing and land use. There's the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. The Justice Department cooperated with us defending one of our clients, even here in Texas and over their land use. And so, the policy that was announced, very early on, we've seen results of it. And that's before you even start talking about, as we said earlier, the types of judges that have been appointed and confirmed that will have decades of influence on the issue.
Matthew Kaczmarek is one you went to.
I went to his investiture.
Thank
yes,
you. I want to make sure I get the name right. Investiture, and he's going to be there for life, right?
He's younger than me. Yes,
yeah.
He's going to be there 30, 40 years if he wants to.
And he's worked with you all these years?
He was Deputy General Counsel for First Liberty Institute. It's the first time in history that an attorney working directly for a nonprofit religious liberty firm went directly from that firm to the federal bench. And he, I wish him all the best and good health so he can be on the court for 30 to 40 years because he is a brilliant, brilliant man. We have seen with the judges, with the policies put in place, there's real hope for the future when it comes to religious liberty. And, I'll just speak for myself. I don't think I was as surprised as anybody by this. It was not what I anticipated out of the Trump administration.
Our caller, I don't know if he's still there, but he mentioned that the president surrounded himself with the bigwigs. And I think what happened was he listened to a lot of them, and even some of his policies that weren't handled in the courts or they weren't handled in Congress or by laws or by applying laws that were already passed were just handled by interpreting things through HHS and other departments in a way that protects religious liberty. And so there have been so many orders that have come out under Trump, under his tenure. And some of these can be reversed, though, under another administration. So it's important to keep dealing with this through the courts and pass good laws. And one of those good laws, of course, and this is mentioned in the Eric Metaxas piece, The Christian Case for Trump. We thought we had it taken care of back in the 90s when the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed. And it's been relied on for protection of religious liberty. But it's under attack now, isn't it? And Eric Metaxas mentioned this. He said, we thought we had this, but we now have to find ourselves defending that.
Right. And, to show you sort of the shift and the drifting or just the hard left direction of the Democrat Party since then, because that was 93. Mm-hmm. That the champion of that bill in the U.S. Senate was Ted Kennedy, and it was signed into law by Bill Clinton. And now the attacks against that are, being led legislatively by, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, who voted for it when he was in the House. And it's important to note, what that bill was. It wasn't like this sort of get out of jail free card. Like all you have to do is just say, well, it's my religious beliefs and everything's going to be okay. But it established that is a legitimate defense when you are sued over whatever it may be, or the government takes action against something that you did, something like what Aaron and Melissa Klein did in Oregon. That's a legitimate defense in cases like these. And the reason they did it was in response to a Supreme Court decision that had
the Smith decision,
employment
which you're
division
trying to change. So I want
That's
you to
exactly
talk about
right.
that in just a minute.
But that is the proper response. If the Supreme Court makes a decision, which they did in employment division versus Smith, it sort of lowered the bar of scrutiny towards government action when it impacts religious freedom, then the appropriate response from Congress is to pass a bill like they did, have the president sign it, which raises that bar back up. And that's what they did. They did not in 93 say, we need to talk about removing Justice Scalia. I'm sure they would have loved to remove Justice Scalia, but it was, ironically enough, one of his opinions. I mean, just proving that nobody's perfect. I think he got that one wrong.
His wife did too. Yeah, that's a funny story.
Yeah, but we, Coach Kennedy's case that we've talked about on here many times. When we lost at the Ninth Circuit and we appealed to the Supreme Court, they denied our appeal, but they did something very, very rare where they issued basically an explanation as to why they denied it, why they didn't take it. And in that explanation, they said, amongst other things, like the district court didn't fully address some questions, and then they went on to say we're deeply concerned over the Ninth Circuit's opinion. And then right at the end of this, they said, we also recognize that the petitioner brought this as a speech case, a religious speech case, when he clearly has a free exercise claim. Perhaps he didn't press the free exercise claim because of previous decisions by this court, which we have not yet been asked to review.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was written by Justice Alito, joined by Gorsuch, Thomas, and Kavanaugh, 4 justices, which it takes 4 votes to vote to take a case at the Supreme Court. And that's Alito doing everything but including the eye wink emoji, saying, hey, maybe you should bring us a chance to look at some of these old decisions. And he is referring to Employment Division versus Smith.
One, yeah.
So that was, even though the Supreme Court denied the case, and now, by the way, we're back at the district court and we're just waiting on the district court's decision now. We filed a motion for summary judgment. We used that explanation from the court as a game plan for Coach Kennedy. But we are prepping that hopefully as a vehicle to get back to the Supreme Court and give them the chance to address Employment Division versus Smith, which would be the biggest win in religious liberty in 30, 40 years. I mean, the free exercise clause has been virtually dormant since Employment Division versus Smith.
Yeah. But to pat you guys on the back, there are 2 clauses to the First Amendment. One is the Establishment Clause, and that one was perverted, I think would be actually fair to say, because of a previous decision, and your decision out of Maryland and the Bladensburg case actually got rid of that. And then the other extra clause is, of course, the Free Exercise Clause, which is, of course, the Smith decision we just talked about, and that could be actually removed because of the Coach Kennedy case. So you could just have a 1-2 punch there on the First Amendment.
That would be quite the resume for our organization if we managed to get rid of both of those. So everybody can certainly keep us in our prayers for that. It would be a great win, not just for Coach Kennedy, but to see his case not just get justice for him, but to end up the potential that it could end up being the case that really reinvigorated the free exercise clause would be quite the poetic justice and quite a great end to this legal odyssey that Coach Kennedy has had to endure for 4 years now.
When we come back from the break,
we wouldn't have had this opportunity if someone else had been in the White House.
Well said. Well said. That's all another reason to read the piece by Eric Metaxas. When we come back, let's stay in the courts. We'll talk about this CNN settlement with Nicholas Sandmann and what that might mean for the future of media coverage. We'll be back right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
for listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
10.5 hour. If you'd like to join us, and I will get to some of those phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts, and let's see if we can for just a minute. Won't spend a lot of time on it. Well, we might. Depends on how far it goes. But if nothing else, this was a case that we've been following. You might remember this young boy from Kentucky, a Covington group, and they were there actually for a March for Life and some other things. He was wearing a Make America Great hat. We all saw the picture where this Native American Indian, Nathan Phillips, come up beating his drum. And then it began. The CNN reporters, Washington Post reporters, and a variety of others now being sued, actually misrepresented him, vilified him, made fun of him. And so his lawyer, Charles Glassner, was able to, first of all, get a settlement from CNN. Others coming, though, Washington Post and a variety of others that I'll talk about in a minute. But he says this, if nothing else, the lawyer said this playing out a little bit like it did the Richard Jewell case. And if you're not familiar with that, well, there's a movie in the theaters right now. Clint Eastwood did on that one, having to do with an individual who was falsely accused during the Atlanta Olympics years ago. And so, if nothing else, Penna, this, I think, could send a message for some of the people in the mainstream media to just pull back. Yet, I guess the lawyer was asked, do they learn? He said, no, they don't learn. But maybe there's at least some victory here on the case of Nick Sandmann, right?
Yes. We don't know how much his settlement was, but there was a settlement. This is a kid who was a student at a Catholic school, and this is about a year ago because the March for Life is coming up in the next couple of weeks, and This was the March for Life. And so the picture that went viral was a picture of Nick Sandmann, and he was kind of in the face of this Native American, and he had what some people would have said a smirk on his face, and all these media outlets jumped to the conclusion that he was making racist remarks and acting racist toward the Native American, and that he was sort of aggressive toward him as a young high school kid. And, wearing, of course, the hat, the Make America Great Again hat was all part of that picture. And it turns out they were all jumping, Washington Post, CNN, a lot of media outlets were jumping to a conclusion. It wasn't true. The aggressor was actually the Native American man and some other groups that were coming around these high school boys. And so when that kind of came out, they felt they actually had the ability and the standing to sue the media outlets, which I commend them for doing because the media gets away with way too much. And they did. And this is the first settlement that's come out since that, where Nick Sandmann is getting a settlement. And when you mention Richard Jewell, I mean, this is back in '96 during the Olympics in Atlanta. And there was an explosion. A bomb went off. Some damage was done. And he became the one who was, I think he was actually jailed. Was he jailed for it? I don't know. We'll find out if we go see the movie. But it turns out he's innocent. And he would, it was kind of common knowledge throughout the country that Richard Jewell had done this. He didn't. So I'm glad Clint Eastwood is doing a movie about it. But now Nick Sandmann has other lawsuits out there pending against other media outlets. So, first of all, as we were saying in the break, you probably won't have to take out any student loans. But the lawyer, one lawyer at least that was commenting on it, says he really doesn't like big settlements against the media because that does sort of, it kind of works against itself in a sense. Yeah. But still, the fact that he got a settlement and they have egg on their face now, will it make a difference? Probably not. But still, I think we can all applaud.
And let me come to you, Lathan, because he is a private citizen. You can get away with saying a lot more about a public figure, but nobody can say that a teenage boy out of Kentucky is a public figure. So that's made it a lot easier in terms of a court of law. And why did CNN settle? Because I think they thought they were going to lose, if not in the court, certainly lose in the court of public opinion. What about that?
I think that's probably right. I mean, you're exactly right as far as the distinction between private citizen and public figures. When someone puts themselves into public figure, whether that's elected office or otherwise, if they're considered a public figure, it's a much higher bar for you to be able to win any sort of litigation over statements in the press or how the press has treated you or printed false things about you or that sort of thing. But I think you're probably right in that CNN likely was eager to settle this because if it went into if the litigation actually made it into court, you're going to have things, discovery, depositions,
other things that were said,
lots of things that then can become public record.
Yeah,
and
they don't want that.
If CNN is looking to avoid that, the best way to do that is settle this before it goes to court.
This attorney that's commenting on it in the Daily Signal said that I mentioned this, he said he's not a proponent of heavy-handed financial costs for media outlets that could hamper the field of journalism. He thinks it would have been better to ask for an apology. And, will we ever see that? Will we see an apology, or was an apology part of this settlement? I don't think so.
Yeah, be interesting to see.
Yeah, I would respectfully probably disagree with the Daily Signal writer there as far as the financial penalty against the media, because CNN is part of a corporation. It is a company. It's part of a company that's business is media, and if you want to affect the behavior of a corporate entity, the way you do that is via the bottom line. And now, I'd be the first to say I think that a lot of penalties imposed by courts or settlements, sometimes they are out of hand.
Yeah, punitive.
Exactly, or things that can't really be quantified.
Yeah,
emotional damages and that sort of thing. And that's why you've seen certain states, Texas in particular, with tort reform, to try to make those things reasonable. But when you're going, if you're a high school kid and your opponent is a multi-billion-dollar media conglomerate, the only way you're going to get their attention is affect the bottom line.
Sure.
And or their public profile. So I think he did what he had to do, and hopefully, he doesn't have to take out any student loans now for college. And, I bet the Washington Post and others are nervously awaiting. We're nervously awaiting the results of this case. Some people don't see the light until they feel some heat,
and so that's the case.
If that is a cautionary tale for the media, then so be it.
He deserves a financial remuneration too, because if it had gone the other way and he's sort of labeled a racist, that stays with you forever.
Yeah. So if nothing else, a victory. Let's take a phone call. I've been not so good in getting some of the calls here, but let's go to Missouri, KNEO. Michael, I think you really had a question about impeachment, and that's been one of the issues we put on the table. So you are on the air. What would you like to ask?
My question is, since Nancy Pelosi has the responsibility of sending the articles of impeachment to the Senate, could she be charged with obstruction of Congress for failing to do her job?
I would just love Louis Gohmert or somebody just out of fun to file a sense of Congress or something, or a censure motion. It would go nowhere, but it would be fun. And Louis Gohmert might be the one to do that.
Anyway.
Just think if you're a member of Congress and they put you through all this and then they didn't even send it over. If you're a Democrat and you really supported impeachment. I mean, I think there's some of the Democrats are breaking from her now and getting impatient.
That's one of the things Lindsey Graham was saying just the other day. He says the impeachment dam is breaking, and that is he was starting to see more and more individuals, especially Democrats on the Senate side, saying, what about this? And everybody's been trying to figure out, why did she do this in the first place? Is it because she was trying to protect a few of these Democrat senators who actually are going to be in the debate next Thursday? Again, we got another one of these Democratic presidential debates, this one in Iowa, and at least it's getting closer to where there's actually a vote. Or was it because she didn't think she was able to, maybe that she could forestall it long enough so that it would just fade away, because she never thought this was really a good idea? Or maybe she just thought in her heart of hearts that maybe she could manipulate Mitch McConnell. I don't know, but I get a sense, and Rush Limbaugh mentioned this the other day, and I thought it was too, there's a sense of frustration. Things that used to work with individuals that maybe didn't have the Donald Trump backbone don't seem to be working right now. And
they don't work with him.
Yeah, they don't seem to work as well. I mean, call a man racist, and they all back up and say, okay, I'm not a racist. He goes, whatever, you can believe everything you want. And then he goes back and calls him something else. And they've never seen anybody quite like this.
I think you're exactly right, and they still, I mean, they've spent 3 years, and will probably spend this year trying to figure out what to do about it, and clearly everything that they have tried so far has not worked. I think she got sort of painted into a corner by the actual leadership in her party. She's the titular head,
yes,
but the people driving the bus is not Nancy Pelosi.
That is for sure. So when we come back from the break, let's talk about people that want to drive the bus, and that are the 5 candidates, I think is all we're going to have on the stage here, that actually have qualified for this Democrat presidential debate. Don't think Amy Klobuchar is going to be around for very long, so it's down to 4. Love to get around the round table and see what you think is going to happen in the Iowa caucus and some of the other primaries. We'll be right back.
Progressive pastor Doug Padgett recently wrote an article for The Hill which he titled, "Evangelicals Are No Longer a Sure Bet for Trump." This is wishful thinking on his part. A column in The New Yorker sheds light on Pastor Padgett's efforts to attract Christian support for Democrat candidates. In her piece, Teaching Democrats to Speak Evangelical, Eliza Griswold explains, Doug Padgett launched an organization called Vote Common Good to tap into the religious left's disappointment over Hillary Clinton's loss in 2016. Post-election statistics showed candidate Clinton failed to woo religious voters, with the drop-off especially sharp among evangelicals. So, for the 2018 midterms, Doug Padgett and 14 other members of Vote Common Good held political/religious revival meetings across the country in support of Democrat candidates. Vote Common Good also trains candidates in speaking to evangelicals. At a gathering of candidates in D.C., the organization's political director, Rob Ryers, advised his audience that, quote, trying to memorize John 3:16 in the car on your way to the event and then quote that is probably not the best way to connect with faith-based voters. Neither is being wrong on important moral issues. In her New Yorker piece, Ms. Griswold writes, the exodus of religious voters from the Democratic Party over the past several decades is typically explained by the culture wars, most notably over abortion. But Doug Padgett and his group aren't buying it. He says voters need to be courted. Does he really expect to convince evangelicals to support candidates whose party allows little or no deviation from pro-abortion, secular progressive dogma? Remember, Bill Clinton touted his motto for making abortion safe, legal, and rare. In 2016, Hillary dropped the word rare. Courting evangelicals must include a robust defense of the sanctity of human life. Evangelicals speak that leaves this out is not believable. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I thought I'd just mention that next Thursday is the Democratic presidential debate. I'm so excited. No, I mean, there have been so many of these now. Even if you're a staunch Democrat, you go, one more? But this will be more significant because it will be in Iowa. I misspoke. Tom Steyer just qualified, so now you have 6 on the stage. That would be Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, as well as Amy Klobuchar, and then Tom Steyer. And Michael Bloomberg could have qualified because he qualified with the polls, but he didn't qualify with the number of donors. So if he picked up enough donors, he might have. So you'll have 6 on the stage. Realistically, we're down to 3 or 4, I think. But, Penna, what's your thoughts? Because we have an Iowa caucus. We have then primaries in Nevada, South Carolina. Of course, you also have Super Tuesday, March 3rd, which is huge. but it's possible that each one of these candidates could win one of these. And since it's proportional, this could go on for a while, couldn't it?
It couldn't. It's funny to see the poll that I just read today out of New Hampshire for 2020 shows a dead heat between 4 candidates.
Yes.
Buttigieg, Biden, Sanders, and Warren, 20%, 19, 18, 15, so within the margin.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the, it's the second contest, the first primary. So we can't even guess who would win that, because after Iowa, things change a little bit. Kim Strassel from the Wall Street Journal put out a sort of an interesting, proposition or idea, and that is that when you see this contest, of course, we've had all these debates and we've seen how far left they are on all kinds of domestic issues. And, it's kind of been surprising in a sense that they're trying to out-liberal each other, but they have been. But now this whole issue with Iran will now show how the shift in foreign policy has, against doing anything common sense to protect us from terrorists. All the Democrats are sort of jumping into that hate Trump derangement. I think that's, in a sense, could show up on Thursday night.
I think it might.
When they're asked questions about this. It's going to be very interesting.
Yeah. How would you have handled it? And, boy, it will be worth watching. And, of course, we'll talk about it next Friday. And both of you guys are going to be here with us next Friday.
Okay,
so if you don't watch it, I'll watch it for you, or I'll bring some clips and we'll talk about it then. What you thought, Lathan?
We'll try.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Okay.
Usually when I try to watch those things, I get tempted to change the channel Elvis style with a handgun.
With a handgun.
But, yeah. It's a shame that Bloomberg didn't make it in.
Yeah.
So
if he could have attracted donors, but
because now the party of the working poor, you only have one billionaire to hear from instead of two.
It's kind of the downside of having a lot of money is you don't have many donors. You don't need them.
And this is the possibility. Now, Buttigieg is still doing pretty well, but it's quite possible that you could have an old white millionaire or billionaire debating Donald Trump, an old white billionaire. I mean, this was not what the Democratic Party wanted. This was supposed to be a woke primary, wasn't it? And Cory Booker's about ready to drop out, and we already recognize all the others that are dropping out and have already dropped out. Andrew Yang, actually, interesting enough, could qualify with the number of donors, but not with the polls. So trying to find any person that is a minority, pretty hard to find. And, of course, we just say, well, why don't we call women a minority? I always have trouble calling them a minority when they are a majority of people. But nevertheless, I don't know that Amy Klobuchar is going anywhere, and I'm really not sure Elizabeth Warren is going anywhere. Do you think?
No, I don't think she's going anywhere. I think the only way she could go somewhere is if this party turns out to be as far left as it is and something happens with Bernie Sanders that does not allow him to run. It does show, the polls do show that she would be the second choice of a lot of Sanders supporters.
And again, if she drops out, that gives us a chance that Bernie could be running against Donald Trump. And that would be a real debate about socialism and free market capitalism, don't you think?
Yeah, it absolutely would. You would have a guy who's never held a job in the private sector debating a guy who has created lots of jobs in the private sector before he became president, to say nothing of the economic record of his first 4 years in office, debating economic policy. That's one I probably would tune in and watch.
Oh, I think so. I'd pay to see that. Let's take a phone call real quickly. I just have not done well with you people today. North Carolina Good News Network, Steve, I think you had a question that maybe Lathan can answer. It's a legal question, so go for it.
Yes, sir. What I'm wondering is, they've tried to make him look bad, and now through this stuff with Iran, can't he, if he can't sue Congress, can he sue them as individuals for defamation of character?
I'm sure that if there was a way for Donald Trump to sue some people, maybe someday he'd think about it, because I don't know of any president who's been more criticized and vilified, first by the mainstream press, second by the opposition party, and third, sometimes by his own party himself. But Donald Trump, the other day, he was speaking at this rally in Ohio and said, I don't think any one of the other candidates could have taken what I've taken. And I thought, he's probably right about that.
They certainly, I don't think, would have dealt with it the way he did.
Yeah.
And the short answer to Steve's question is, unfortunately, no. I mean, Jay Sekulow is a great attorney, and I know he's one of Trump's attorneys, but you got one public figure saying bad things about another public figure. The likelihood of that ever seen inside of a courtroom.
That's what you sign up for.
That's right. Just before we end, I thought, this week we thought we were close to World War III. I never really thought so, but this piece by Garrett Graff is really interesting. By the way, he's written a number of books about the Cold War and reminds us that back with the Cuban Missile Crisis, you were too young, but the rest of us remember in the 1960s, a real confrontation between John F. Kennedy and, of course, Nikita Khrushchev. And they were talking about how when the embassy tried to get something over to us, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, it took 12 hours to encode what essentially are 5 typed pages. The Soviet embassy was trying to get something out, so finally they actually got a guy from the Western Union to ride a bicycle to Western Union to get it out. And finally, Khrushchev himself was so frustrated with this, he would just have the letter read over Radio Moscow to get information back and forth. Of course, they had back channels. What a difference when at 9:32 you have Zavid Jarif, as I mentioned before, an individual with a PhD, very good in terms of English, International Law from the University of Denver, writes, and this is at 9:32.
He's the foreign minister
He's
for
the foreign
Iran.
ministry for Iran. And so the foreign minister writes, Iran took and concluded proportionate measures in self-defense, goes on to say, we do not seek escalation or war, but will defend ourselves. So that was the tweet. 12 minutes later from a hashtag real Donald Trump tweeting to his 70 million followers that all is well, and essentially saying we can all go to bed. And so it was almost like we could watch before our very eyes how one Twitter post responded to the other Twitter post, and the de-escalation took place. And so I don't know.
You didn't have time for people to wonder
yes.
what was in their mind. What are they going to do? Because it was all out there.
I don't know
cyberspace.
when Twitter was invented that anybody thought that this would be used in international negotiations, but that's exactly what has happened, right?
Yeah, and I'm the first one to critique our president and his use of Twitter, but I got to say,
worked.
I mean, if that's the way of the world these days, and we just avoided further escalation via Twitter, then so be it. I mean,
the Twitter post, all is well, so far so good, and a few other things. He does have this tendency to say we have the strongest military in the world, and then the next day he talks about our missiles are bigger than theirs. I'm like, oh, please. But anyway.
But he lowered some people's blood pressure.
He certainly did. And by the way, Zarif has a Twitter account with 1 million followers. Donald Trump has a Twitter account with 70 million. More people get his Twitter account than listen to or watch any TV program or news program or all of them combined. So that's why he uses Twitter. So just an interesting week, and I'm looking forward to both of you next week. And if nothing else, we'll be able to talk about that presidential debate. But I got a feeling there'll probably be some other things on the docket. If you would like to know more about First Liberty, go to the picture there of Lathan Watts. Just click on that. It'll take you to firstliberty.org, and you can also do some things to encourage the Kleins as well. But that's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.